The Misbeel heresy files. Were these beliefs truly a threat to everything? From the 11th to the 15th centuries, what ideas dared to challenge the very foundations of the world? Number 5. The Cathars. In the sun-drenched lands of Occitania, a region now known as southern France, a shadow was spreading. Not a literal shadow, but a set of beliefs that were so radically different, so completely at odds with the established church, that they ignited a firestorm across Europe. These were the Cathars, sometimes called the Albigensians, named after the city of Albi, one of their strongholds. Their story is one of profound faith, unwavering conviction, and ultimately brutal suppression. Cathar movement began to gain serious traction in the 11th century, reaching its peak influence in the 12th and early 13th centuries. It was not a simple disagreement over a minor point of doctrine. The Cathars presented a complete alternative universe, a different way of understanding existence itself. Their core belief was a form of dualism. This meant they believed in two fundamental principles, two gods or two powers. There was a good God, the creator of the spiritual world, and an evil God, the creator of the material world. This idea turned everything on its head. For the Cathars, the world we live in, the physical world of bodies, food, and possessions, was inherently bad. It was the creation of the evil God, often associated with the Old Testament God, who demanded sacrifices and punishments. The good God, on the other hand, was the God of the New Testament, the God of love, who created souls and the invisible realm. Human beings were trapped in this evil material world, their good souls imprisoned in corrupt bodies. Because the physical world was evil, Cathar beliefs naturally led to very specific ways of living. Marriage was seen as undesirable because it perpetuated the creation of more bodies, more prisons for souls. Eating meat, eggs, and dairy products was forbidden because these were products of animal procreation. Strict Cathars, known as the perfecti, lived incredibly ascetic lives. They would fast for long periods, never marry, and own no property. They were the spiritual elite, revered by their followers, who were known as credent. Credents, while not expected to adhere to such extreme asceticism, aspired to it, and supported the perfecti. The Cathars rejected many pillars of the Catholic Church. They saw the Church itself as a part of the evil material world, corrupted by wealth and power. They had no faith in sacraments, like baptism or the Eucharist, viewing them as physical rituals that could not cleanse a spiritual soul. They believed in reincarnation, that souls would continue to be reborn into different bodies until they finally achieved salvation and escaped the material cycle. Their only sacrament was the consolamentum, a spiritual baptism performed by a perfectus, which they believed cleansed the soul and allowed it to ascend to the good God upon death. The rise of Catharism was not sudden. Southern France was a fertile ground for new ideas, a place where different cultures and intellectual currents mingled. The local nobility, the Counts of Toulouse, the Viscounts of Béziers, and others were often tolerant of the Cathars, perhaps seeing them as a way to assert independence from the distant authority of the Pope and the King of France. Some noblewomen in particular found the Cathar message appealing, as it offered a spiritual path that seemed less hierarchical and more focused on inner purity. The Catholic Church in Rome, however, saw the Cathars as an existential threat. Not only did their doctrines directly contradict fundamental Christian teachings about creation, the nature of Christ and the sacraments, but their rejection of church authority and wealth was deeply unsettling. If the material world was evil, then the Church's vast landholdings, its beautiful cathedrals, and its powerful clergy were all tainted. This struck at the very heart of the Church's earthly power and its role as the sole path to salvation. Early attempts to combat Catharism were mostly through peaceful persuasion. Cistercian monks, and later the nascent orders of Dominicans and Franciscans, were sent to preach against the Cathars, to win them back through argument and example. Saint Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order, spent years in Occitania, living in poverty and preaching the Orthodox faith, trying to counter the influence of the perfecti. He engaged in public debates, sometimes drawing large crowds. Records tell of one such debate in Fangio, where both Catholic and Cathar texts were thrown into a fire, and only the Catholic texts miraculously remained unburned. But these efforts proved largely ineffective against the deeply entrenched Cathar communities. The movement continued to grow, its adherents reportedly numbering in the tens of thousands. The tipping point came in 1208. Pope Innocent III had sent a papal legate, Peter of Castelnau, to the region to address the Cathar problem. Peter excommunicated Raymond VI, the Count of Toulouse, for his perceived leniency towards the Cathars. Shortly after, Peter of Castelnau was assassinated. Though Raymond VI denied involvement, the Pope saw this as a deliberate act of defiance and a clear sign that persuasion was no longer enough. Pope Innocent III then called for a crusade. This was no ordinary crusade against distant lands. This was a crusade against Christians, or at least against those the Church considered heretics within Europe itself. The Albigensian Crusade, as it became known, lasted for nearly 20 years, from 1209 to 1229. Northern French knights, eager for land and spiritual reward, poured into the south. The brutality of the crusade was immense. One of the most infamous episodes occurred at the siege of Béziers in July 1209. When the Crusaders breached the city walls, the question arose of how to distinguish Catholics from Cathars within the city. Papal legate Arnaud Amalric supposedly uttered the chilling command, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Whether these exact words were spoken or not, the result was a horrific massacre. Thousands of men, women, and children were slaughtered, regardless of their religious beliefs. Béziers was burned to the ground. Other strongholds fell. Carcassonne was besieged, its inhabitants eventually allowed to leave with nothing but their clothes. Simon de Montfort, a zealous and ruthless northern French nobleman, emerged as the military leader of the crusade, seizing vast territories and brutally suppressing any resistance. The war was complex, often involving political power struggles between northern and southern French nobles, in addition to the religious conflict. Raymond VI and later his son Raymond VII fought desperately to retain their lands and independence, sometimes aligning themselves with the King of Aragon, but ultimately they were outmatched. Treaty of Paris in 1229 officially ended the Albigensian Crusade, though fighting continued for years afterward. Treaty effectively integrated Occitania into the French crown lands, significantly strengthening the power of the French king and weakening the once independent southern nobility. Cathars, however, were not entirely eradicated by the military campaign. They went underground, their perfecti living secret lives, ministering to their scattered flocks. To deal with these persistent pockets of heresy, the Church developed a new tool, the Papal Inquisition. While local bishops had always had the power to investigate heresy, the new Papal Inquisition, formally established in the 1230s, was a more systematic and centralized institution. Dominicans and later Franciscans were often appointed as inquisitors, given special powers to seek out, question, and judge suspected heretics. The inquisitors arrived in Occitania with meticulous records and a network of informants. They conducted investigations, sometimes through public sermons calling on people to confess their sins or denounce others. Those accused were brought before the inquisitor, often without knowing their accusers. Torture was eventually sanctioned by the Church as a means to extract confessions, though its use was regulated, at least in theory, and varied over time and place. The most famous inquisitor in the region was Bernard Guy, who served in Toulouse for over 15 years in the early 14th century. His detailed manual, The Conduct of the Inquisition of Heretical Depravity, provided guidance for future inquisitors, describing Cathar beliefs and methods for extracting confessions. Records from the Inquisition, including those compiled by Guy, provide invaluable, though often biased, insights into the lives and beliefs of the Cathars and the mechanisms of their persecution. The punishments for heresy were severe. Those who confessed and recanted might receive penances, pilgrimages, or be forced to wear yellow crosses on their clothing as a mark of shame. Repeat offenders, or those who refused to recant, faced harsher penalties. Their property could be confiscated, and they could be imprisoned for life. The ultimate punishment, reserved for the most obstinate or for perfecti who refused to renounce their faith, was execution by burning. This was seen not as a punishment inflicted by the Church itself, but as a secular penalty, a handover to the secular arm, although the Church clearly facilitated it. The fire, it was believed, purified the land of the heretical taint. The last known Cathar, perfectus Guillaume Bélibaste, was burned at the stake in 1321. By the mid-14th century, the combination of the Crusade, the relentless pursuit by the Inquisition, and the gradual erosion of their social support network had effectively extinguished Catharism as an organized movement. Its unique dualist vision, so challenging to the medieval worldview, faded into memory, leaving behind a scarred landscape and a dark chapter in religious history. The echoes of its suppression, however, shaped the future of both secular and ecclesiastical power in Europe. Number 4. The Waldensians. High in the valleys of the Alps, spanning regions of what are now France and Italy, a different kind of challenge to the established order was taking root. This was the Waldensian movement, a group that started not with radical theological doctrines but with a profound desire for apostolic poverty and preaching. Their story is a powerful example of how a quest for spiritual purity and adherence to biblical teachings could inadvertently lead to a collision with powerful religious institutions. The Waldensian movement began in the late 12th century, around 1170, with a wealthy merchant named Valdez, or Peter Waldo of Lyon. Accounts describe Waldo as a successful businessman who, after hearing the sermon about St. Alexius giving up his wealth, or perhaps after a conversation with a learned theologian, underwent a profound spiritual conversion. He decided to abandon his comfortable life, distributing his substantial wealth to the poor, keeping only enough to provide for his family. Waldo's core desire was to live like the apostles, following the teachings of Jesus directly from the Gospels. He commissioned scholars to translate parts of the Bible, especially the New Testament, into the vernacular, the common language spoken by ordinary people in his region. This was a radical step at a time when the Bible was primarily in Latin, accessible only to the educated clergy. Waldo believed that everyone should be able to read and understand God's Word for themselves. Once he had access to these translated scriptures, Waldo and his followers began to preach. They called themselves the Poor Men of Lyon, emphasizing their commitment to voluntary poverty, a stark contrast to the perceived wealth and worldly power of many high-ranking church officials. They traveled from town to town, 2 by 2, wearing simple cloaks, preaching in the streets and market squares, explaining the Gospels to anyone who would listen. Their message was simple: repent, live a life of poverty, and follow Christ's teachings directly. Initially, the Church's reaction was not outright condemnation. In 1179, Waldo and some of his followers traveled to Rome to present their translations and their way of life to Pope Alexander III at the Third Lateran Council. Pope reportedly praised their commitment to poverty but forbade them from preaching without the permission of local bishops. This was a crucial point of contention. The Waldensians believed that since they were following Christ's command to preach, they did not need permission from human authority. They saw their mission as directly ordained by God. This refusal to cease unauthorized preaching led to their eventual condemnation. Local bishops in Lyon and other areas quickly saw the Waldensian activities as a challenge to their authority. Preaching was considered a prerogative of the clergy, requiring theological training and ecclesiastical license. Allowing untrained lay people to preach, especially with translations of the Bible that might be interpreted in ways contrary to church doctrine, was seen as dangerous and potentially chaotic. By 1184, the Waldensians were formally excommunicated by Pope Lucius III at the Council of Verona, alongside the Cathars and other groups. They were deemed heretics, not primarily for their core beliefs, which at this point were still largely orthodox, but for their disobedience to church hierarchy and their unauthorized preaching. The act of going against the church was in itself a grave offense. After their excommunication, the Waldensians were forced to go underground or flee. Many settled in the more remote alpine valleys, which became their refuges for centuries. Their beliefs began to evolve in response to their persecution and their separation from the mainstream church. They continued to emphasize the Bible as the supreme authority, even above papal pronouncements. They rejected purgatory, prayers for the dead, and the veneration of saints, arguing these practices were not found in the scriptures. They also questioned the efficacy of sacraments administered by priests who were deemed sinful, an idea known as Donatism. They began to administer their own sacraments, and some of their barbs or preachers acted as spiritual leaders and administrators of communion. The Waldensians also challenged the idea of a priestly class as distinct from ordinary believers. They believed that any good Christian man or woman could preach and perform spiritual duties. This concept of the priesthood of all believers was a radical departure from the hierarchical structure of the medieval church. They were also critical of the church's wealth and its involvement in temporal affairs, seeing it as a betrayal of Christ's example. Their practices were often simple and austere. They met in secret, in homes or hidden caves, to avoid detection. They memorized large portions of the Bible and passed on their teachings orally from generation to generation. Education was highly valued among them, particularly for their preachers, who were trained to be able to recite and explain the scriptures. Church, through its growing inquisitorial apparatus, pursued the Waldensians with vigor. Inquisitors like the infamous Bernard Guy, who also dealt with Cathars, left records of numerous Waldensian trials. The Waldensians faced the same brutal penalties as other heretics: confiscation of property, imprisonment, and execution by burning for those who refused to recant. Many Waldensians were martyred for their faith. Despite relentless persecution, the Waldensian movement proved remarkably resilient. Their tight-knit communities, often isolated by geography, helped them survive. They developed sophisticated networks for communication and support. They also mastered the art of dissimulation, outwardly conforming to Catholic practices while secretly maintaining their own beliefs. They would attend Mass, but then hold their own services later, where they would share their interpretations of the Bible. Pressure on the Waldensians intensified during the 14th and 15th centuries. Papal bulls were issued calling for their extermination. Crusades were launched against them, particularly in the French and Italian Alps. In 1487, Pope Innocent VIII ordered a crusade led by Albert Cataneo against the Waldensians in the Dauphiné and Piedmont valleys. The Crusader armies burned villages, destroyed crops, and massacred inhabitants, driving many into the mountains where they perished from cold and hunger. Yet, they endured. Their survival against such overwhelming odds is a testament to their deep conviction and communal strength. Unlike the Cathars, who faded into history, the Waldensians maintained a continuous, though often clandestine, existence throughout the medieval period and beyond. They were one of the few medieval groups to survive into the Reformation era. When the Protestant Reformation swept across Europe in the 16th century, The Waldensians, now centuries old, discovered they had much in common with the new Protestant churches, particularly those of the Reformed tradition. They sent delegates to Switzerland and Germany, eventually formally aligning themselves with the Protestant movement, adopting some of its doctrines while retaining their own unique historical identity. This alignment brought them into the larger Protestant fold, but did not end their struggles. They continued to face persecution from Catholic authorities for centuries, though with different political dynamics. The Waldensian story is a powerful reminder that not all challenges to the medieval church were about radical theological breaks. Sometimes they were about a sincere desire to return to what was perceived as a purer, earlier form of Christianity, a desire that, when coupled with a challenge to established authority, became labeled as a dangerous heresy. Their commitment to the vernacular Bible and lay preaching foreshadowed major themes of the later Reformation, making their survival a significant, if often quiet, thread in the tapestry of European religious history. Their legacy continues today, with Waldensian churches existing across the globe, a testament to their enduring faith and resilience. Number 3. The Lollards. Across the English Channel, in the late 14th century, another fiery challenge to the medieval church was igniting. This movement, known as Lollardy, emerged from the intellectual ferment of Oxford University and quickly spread among the common people. At its heart was a brilliant but controversial scholar named John Wycliffe, whose ideas shook the very foundations of religious and political power in England. John Wycliffe was a master of Balliol College, Oxford, and a highly respected theologian and philosopher. His career began in the mid-14th century, a time of immense upheaval in Europe. The Black Death had devastated populations, the 100 Years' War raged, and the Western Schism saw multiple popes claiming authority simultaneously, greatly diminishing the Church's prestige and moral standing. These crises created fertile ground for questioning and reform. Wycliffe's ideas developed over time, starting with criticisms of clerical wealth and abuses. He argued that the Church, particularly its clergy, had become too worldly, too focused on temporal power and possessions rather than spiritual guidance. He believed that the Church should divest itself of its vast properties and return to the apostolic poverty of the early Christian community. He also asserted that the Church should be subordinate to the state in temporal matters, a controversial stance that appealed to some English nobles who resented papal interference and church wealth. One of Wycliffe's most radical ideas was his doctrine of dominion by grace. Posited that true authority, whether spiritual or temporal, came directly from God and was only legitimately held by those in a state of grace. If a cleric, including the Pope, was living in sin, then his authority was invalid. This idea directly challenged the hierarchical structure of the Church and the Pope's absolute spiritual authority, suggesting that the Pope could be a heretic if he was not living righteously. Wycliffe's theological arguments went further, directly attacking central Church doctrines. He denied the doctrine of transubstantiation, the belief that during the Eucharist the bread and wine literally transform into the body and blood of Christ while retaining their outward appearance. Wycliffe argued for consubstantiation, suggesting that Christ's body and blood were present with the bread and wine, but that the substances themselves did not change. This was a profound departure from established dogma and struck at the heart of the priest's unique power to perform the miracle of the Mass. He also questioned the effectiveness of indulgences, pilgrimages, and the veneration of saints and relics, seeing them as superstitious practices that diverted attention from direct worship of God and were often exploited by corrupt clergy for financial gain. He believed that salvation came through God's grace and personal faith, not through rituals or the intercession of the Church. Perhaps Wycliffe's most enduring and influential contribution was his fervent belief in the supreme authority of the Bible. He argued that the Scriptures, not papal decrees or church traditions, were the ultimate source of Christian truth. To make the Bible accessible to everyone, he initiated the translation of the entire Latin Vulgate Bible into English. This was a massive undertaking. Carried out by his followers and completed around 1382, this Wycliffe Bible was highly controversial. The Church maintained that vernacular translations were dangerous, potentially leading to misinterpretations and heresy by the uneducated. Wycliffe's teachings gained a significant following, not just among academics but also among ordinary people, particularly merchants, artisans, and some gentry. These followers, known as Lollards, were often itinerant preachers traveling across England, spreading Wycliffe's ideas in simple language. They were sometimes called poor preachers, echoing the Waldensians' emphasis on poverty. They would read from the translated Bible, criticize clerical abuses, and advocate for a simpler, more direct form of Christianity. The Lollard movement presented multiple threats to the Church and the social order. The attack on transubstantiation undermined the very basis of priestly power. Call for disendowment of church property threatened its wealth and influence. The emphasis on lay access to the Bible in English, combined with the dominion by grace argument, challenged the clergy's unique role as intermediaries between God and man. If everyone could read the Bible and interpret it, what need was there for an elaborate, hierarchical church? Initially, Wycliffe enjoyed some protection from powerful figures in the English court, like John of Gaunt, who found Wycliffe's criticisms of church wealth politically convenient. However, as Wycliffe's ideas became more extreme, even his protectors distanced themselves. Church councils repeatedly condemned his teachings. Council of London in 1382 condemned 24 of Wycliffe's propositions as heretical or erroneous. Yet, Wycliffe himself was never formally tried as a heretic or executed. He died peacefully in 1384. After Wycliffe's death, the Lollard movement continued, but it faced increasing persecution. English Crown, concerned about social unrest and rebellion, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, though not directly caused by Lollardy, made authorities wary of any challenge to established order, allied with the Church to suppress the movement. In 1401, the Statute de Heretico Comburendo, on the burning of heretics, was enacted, making heresy punishable by burning at the stake in England. This was the first statute of its kind in England, and signaled a harsh new era for Lollards. William Saltrey, a Lollard priest, became the first Lollard martyr, burned in 1401. Other notable Lollards followed, including John Badby in 1410 and Sir John Oldcastle, a prominent knight, in 1417. Oldcastle's rebellion in 1414, though ultimately unsuccessful, further solidified the authorities' view that Lollardy was not just a theological disagreement, but a dangerous social and political threat. The Lollards continued their clandestine activities throughout the 15th century, meeting in secret, sharing their forbidden Bibles, and passing on their teachings. They often came from the lower and middle classes, finding their communities among weavers, artisans, and laborers. They developed codes and networks to evade detection by church and royal authorities. Lollard books, often meticulously copied and hidden, were discovered in secret compartments and walls, revealing the enduring commitment of their adherents. The English Church, through its archbishops and bishops, conducted vigorous campaigns against Lollardy. Accused Lollards faced interrogations, often involving intense pressure to recant. Those who persisted faced the same fate as Oldcastle. Despite these efforts, Lollard ideas continued to simmer beneath the surface of English society. They were never entirely stamped out. While Lollardy did not lead to a full-scale social revolution or a complete break with Rome in the 15th century, its influence was significant. It fostered a tradition of dissent, a questioning of papal authority, and a desire for vernacular scripture that endured. When the Protestant Reformation arrived in England in the 16th century, propelled by King Henry VIII's desire for an annulment and later by genuinely reformed theological ideas, it found a surprising number of people receptive to its message. Some historians suggest that Lollardy created a receptive intellectual and spiritual environment, a seedbed for the later English Reformation. The Lollard movement, with its emphasis on biblical authority, its critique of clerical corruption, and its challenge to the sacraments, represented a potent internal threat to the medieval church in England. Though suppressed, its ideas lingered, demonstrating how theological arguments could intertwine with social and political grievances to create a persistent, if underground, current of religious reform. The brave acts of its adherents who risked everything for their beliefs carved a distinct path in the long history of religious nonconformity. Number 2. The Hussites. Across the continent, in the Kingdom of Bohemia, a profoundly influential and violent religious movement was taking shape in the early 15th century. This was Hussitism, named after its Medoc leader, Jan Hus. Hussitism was not just a theological dispute, it was a powerful national movement, a social upheaval, and ultimately, a series of devastating wars that reshaped the political and religious landscape of Central Europe. Jan Hus was a Czech scholar, theologian, and rector of Charles University in Prague. Born around 1370, he lived at a time when Bohemia was experiencing a resurgence of Czech national identity and a growing resentment towards German influence, both within the university and the church. Hus was deeply influenced by the writings of John Wycliffe, whose ideas on church reform had made their way from England to Prague. Many of Wycliffe's books were translated and widely read by Czech intellectuals, including Hus. Hus began preaching at Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, a large chapel specifically designed for sermons in the Czech language. He quickly gained a massive following, both among the common people and among the Czech nobility. He echoed Wycliffe's criticisms of the church, denouncing clerical abuses, simony, the selling of church offices, and the vast wealth of the clergy. He called for a return to the purity and poverty of the early church. Like Wycliffe, Hus believed that the Bible was the supreme authority for Christian faith and life. He encouraged lay people to read the scriptures for themselves and advocated for the sermon to be the central part of the Mass, delivered in the vernacular. His fiery preaching against moral decay in the church resonated deeply with a populace disillusioned by the ongoing Western schism, which saw three different men simultaneously claiming to be the rightful pope. This schism severely damaged the church's credibility. Hus's key theological differences from the established church, while similar to Wycliffe's, gained their own distinct Bohemian flavor. He taught that the pope was not the head of the church, but that Christ alone was the head. He maintained that no ecclesiastical authority, including the Pope, could contradict the law of Christ or command something contrary to God's law. If they did, they should not be obeyed. A significant point of contention for Hus, and later for the Hussite movement, was the practice of communion in one kind. In the medieval Catholic Church, only the priest partook of both the bread and the wine during the Eucharist. Lay people received only the bread, representing Christ's body. Hus, however, argued that according to Scripture and the practice of the early church, communion should be administered in both kinds, meaning both bread and wine, to all communicants, including the laity. This became known as utriquism, from the Latin sub utraque specie, meaning under both kinds. The chalice, or cup, became a central symbol of the Hussite movement. Hus's teachings spread rapidly throughout Bohemia, leading to widespread popular support, but also strong opposition from the church hierarchy and some German elements within Bohemia. He was accused of heresy and repeatedly summoned to Rome. He refused to go, arguing that he was being persecuted unjustly. In 1411, he was excommunicated by the Pope. Despite the excommunication, Hus continued to preach, protected by some Bohemian nobles. To resolve the Western schism, and address widespread calls for church reform. The Council of Constance was convened in 1414. John Hus was invited to attend, granted a letter of safe conduct by Emperor Sigismund, the future Holy Roman Emperor. Hus believed he would have an opportunity to defend his views and argue for reform. However, upon his arrival in Constance, the safe conduct was disregarded. He was arrested, imprisoned, and subjected to a lengthy trial for heresy. During the trial, Hus staunchly refused to recant his beliefs unless he could be shown from Scripture where he was in error. He maintained that he was not a heretic and that his views were consistent with true Christian doctrine. Council, however, condemned 30 articles taken from his writings, declaring them heretical. On July 6, 1415, Jan Hus was condemned as an obstinate heretic and handed over to the secular authorities. He was immediately burned at the stake, his ashes scattered in the Rhine River to prevent his followers from collecting relics. Hus's execution sparked outrage and defiance in Bohemia. He became a national martyr and a symbol of Czech resistance. His followers, now known as Hussites, united in their condemnation of his execution and their determination to uphold his teachings. This led to the formation of a powerful unified movement, split into several factions, but bound by their shared veneration of Hus and their distinct theological positions. The two main Hussite factions were the moderate Utraquists, or Calixtines, from calix meaning chalice, who primarily sought communion in both kinds, free preaching of the word and a reformed church, and the radical Taborites, named after their fortified city of Tabor. Taborites rejected much of the traditional church structure, including veneration of saints, monasticism, and private confession. They advocated for a complete break with Rome and a more egalitarian society. They were highly militaristic, believing that the righteous must fight to establish God's kingdom on earth. The death of John Hus, combined with the subsequent death of King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia in 1419, led to open rebellion. Emperor Sigismund Hus's betrayer claimed the Bohemian throne, but the Hussites refused to recognize him. The Hussite Wars erupted, lasting from 1419 to 1434. These were some of the most brutal and innovative wars of the medieval period. The Hussites, particularly the Taborites, developed highly effective military tactics. Led by brilliant commanders like Jan Zizga, a one-eyed general who never lost a major battle, and later Prokop the Great, they utilized armored wagons, wagon forts, and early forms of artillery to devastating effect. They repeatedly defeated the larger, heavily armored Crusader armies sent against them by the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. 5 major crusades were launched against Bohemia, all of which failed. The Hussites raided neighboring countries, spreading fear and their message. The Hussite wars were not just military conflicts, but also internal struggles among the Hussite factions themselves. Ultimately, the more moderate Utraquists sought a compromise with the Catholic Church. This led to negotiations at the Council of Basel. In 1436, the Compacta of Basel were signed, granting the Bohemians the right to communion in both kinds and recognizing some other Hussite demands in exchange for their nominal submission to the Pope and the Emperor. This compromise effectively ended the Hussite Wars. The Compacta, however, did not fully satisfy all Hussites. Taborites, who refused to accept the compromise, were eventually defeated by a combined force of Utraquists and Catholics at the Battle of Lipany in 1434. This marked the end of the radical Hussite military power. The Hussite movement had profound and lasting consequences. It established a unique religious identity in Bohemia, one that was distinct from both Roman Catholicism and later the emerging Protestant movements. The Utraquist Church survived in Bohemia for centuries, even before the Reformation, making it one of the earliest successful reform movements in Europe. The Hussites also influenced later reformers, including Martin Luther, who recognized Hus as a precursor to his own reform efforts. The Hussite Wars demonstrated the immense power of religious conviction combined with national identity. They also showed that a well-organized and motivated populace could defy the might of a vast empire and the authority of the papacy. The memory of John Hus and the Hussite Wars remained a potent force in Czech history, a testament to a period when a profound theological challenge became a catalyst for national struggle and religious self-determination. The chalice remained a symbol of Bohemian identity long after the wars ended. Number 1. Arianism. Centuries before the Hussites, the Lollards, or the Cathars, a controversy erupted that shook the very foundations of Christian belief. This was Arianism, a theological dispute that began in the 4th century, but whose profound implications and lingering influence echoed through the early medieval period and shaped how the Church defined its core understanding of God. While often associated with the late Roman Empire, its challenges and the Orthodox responses to it were foundational for all subsequent medieval theology, continually referenced and battled against in various forms throughout the early medieval centuries, as new Germanic kingdoms adopted Christian faiths. At the heart of Arianism was a simple yet explosive question: what was the true nature of Jesus Christ? Arius, a priest from Alexandria, Egypt, around the early 4th century, proposed a doctrine that sought to preserve the absolute oneness and uniqueness of God the Father. For Arius, God the Father was utterly unbegotten and uncreated. He was the sole true God. From this premise, Arius concluded that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, must have been created by the Father. He argued that there was a time when the Son was not. This meant that the Son was not co-eternal with the Father. While Christ might be the first and greatest of all creation, and even divine in a secondary sense, he was not of the same substance or nature as God the Father. He was a creature, albeit a supreme one, chosen by God to be his Son. This idea seemed logical to many at the time. It made sense of passages in the New Testament that describe Jesus as subordinate to the Father, or as having been begotten. It also helped maintain a strict monotheism, avoiding any suggestion of two gods or two divine beings. However, Arianism immediately ignited a firestorm within the Christian community. Opponents, most famously Athanasius of Alexandria, argued that if Christ was a created being, then he could not truly be God in the fullest sense. If he was not truly God, then how could he redeem humanity? How could a created being bridge the infinite gap between a perfect God and sinful humanity? The very act of salvation, they argued, depended on Christ being fully divine, God from God, light from light, true God from true God. If Christ was not truly God, then salvation was undermined, and worship of Christ became a form of idolatry. The theological debate was fierce, conducted in sermons, pamphlets, and personal letters, became so disruptive that the Roman Emperor Constantine I, who had recently legalized Christianity, intervened. Convened the First Council of Nicaea in 325 CE to resolve the dispute and establish a unified Christian doctrine. At Nicaea, the primary theological term debated was homoousios, meaning of the same substance as the Father, championed by Athanasius. The Arians preferred homoiousos, meaning of similar substance, or other terms emphasizing Christ's distinctness and subordination. The council ultimately affirmed the homoousios position, declaring Christ to be begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father. The Nicene Creed, still recited by many Christians today, was formulated at this council, specifically rejecting Arian tenets. Despite the Council of Nicaea's strong condemnation, Arianism did not simply vanish. Its proponents continued to preach and gain influence. Emperors after Constantine, notably Constantius II and Valens, favored Arianism. leading to periods of imperial support for Arian bishops and persecution of Nicene Christians. The theological pendulum swung back and forth for decades. Arianism also spread to many Germanic tribes during the 4th and 5th centuries through the missionary efforts of figures like Ulfilas, who translated the Bible into the Gothic language. As these Germanic tribes, including the Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, and Lombards, established kingdoms within the former Western Roman Empire, they often remained Arian Christians, even as the Roman populations they conquered adhered to Nicene or Trinitarian Christianity. This created a significant religious divide across early medieval Europe. In places like the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, and the Visigothic kingdom in Spain and Gaul, the Arian rulers and their warrior elites were distinct from their Catholic subjects. This religious difference often fueled tensions, as the Arian rulers sometimes persecuted Nicene Christians, viewing them as disloyal or religiously incorrect. For example, the Vandal king Gaiseric, a staunch Arian, persecuted Catholic bishops and confiscated church property in North Africa. Church in the early medieval period, particularly the papacy and prominent bishops, continued to combat Arianism as a fundamental threat to Orthodox Christian doctrine. They emphasized the importance of the Nicene Creed as the touchstone of true faith. Church councils and theological treatises were dedicated to refuting Arian arguments and solidifying the doctrine of the Trinity, the belief in one God existing as three co-equal, co-eternal persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The struggle against Arianism involved not just theological arguments, but also political maneuvering and military conflict. Conversion of the Frankish king Clovis to Nicene Catholicism around 496 CE was a pivotal moment. Unlike the Arian Germanic rulers, Clovis embraced the faith of the majority of his Gallo-Roman subjects. This alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the Nicene Church would prove incredibly powerful, laying the groundwork for the future Holy Roman Empire. Over time, the Arian Germanic kingdoms gradually converted to Nicene Christianity. The Vandals were defeated by the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century, and their Arian kingdom collapsed. The Ostrogoths in Italy were also conquered by the Byzantines. The Visigoths in Spain eventually converted to Nicene Christianity under King Recordai at the Third Council of Toledo in 589 CE, abandoning their Arian faith. The Lombards in Italy were the last major Germanic group to convert, completing their transition to Nicene Catholicism by the late 7th century. The eventual triumph of Nicene Christianity over Arianism was not just a theological victory, but also a significant factor in the consolidation of political power and the forging of a common European entity under the banner of Roman Catholicism. The process was slow and often involved violence, but by the end of the early medieval period, Arianism as an organized, widespread movement had largely faded. However, the questions it raised about the nature of Christ and the Trinity continued to resonate through theological discussions for centuries. Medieval theologians, when discussing the divine nature, the Incarnation, or the Trinity, would often refer back to the Arian controversy as a foundational heresy, emphasizing the importance of understanding Christ as truly God and truly man. The debates owned the Church's theological language and solidified its core doctrines, providing the intellectual framework for all subsequent medieval theological thought. Arianism, though defeated, left an indelible mark by forcing the Church to define with greater precision the very nature of the divine. Its history stands as a stark reminder of how fundamental theological differences could ignite centuries of conflict and fundamentally shape the course of history.